Powerful lawyer kicks out his wife and son. Years later, he begs his son for mercy. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Paul Marston stood in his lavish office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, a view he'd fought tooth and nail to attain. At 52, he was the name on everyone's lips in the legal world. A powerhouse attorney with a reputation for ruthless ambition and strategic prowess. His life was polished to perfection, from his designer suits to the high-rise penthouse that symbolized his triumph. Yet tonight, an unusual flicker of irritation crossed his mind. His wife, Rachel, had dared to suggest he valued his work more than his family. The argument had erupted in their pristine living room, raw and unforgiving, tearing away the gloss of their marriage. Rachel had stood, unwavering, throwing his own words back at him, accusing him of abandoning her and their young son Jake. For Paul, family had always felt like an anchor, a distraction from his relentless drive. When Rachel challenged him to choose between them and his ambition, he made his decision with cold precision. "Then go," he'd said, the words final, laced with a certainty he didn't expect her to challenge. But Rachel, with a steeliness he hadn't anticipated, accepted. "One day you'll realize what you've lost, Paul," she said as she gathered Jake, her gaze steady. "But by then it'll be too late." Rachel moved into a modest apartment with Jake, cutting ties with the privileged world they'd known. She took on multiple jobs to make ends meet, her determination fueled by the need to create a stable life for Jake. She became both mother and father, filling their home with warmth and resilience. Jake grew up hearing the name Marston, but it was his mother's influence, her strength and grace, that shaped him. Years passed, and Jake grew into a young man guided by his mother's unshakable morals. He watched her work, admired her dedication, and learned to value integrity above all. Though he was well aware of his father's success, Jake felt no urge to follow in his footsteps. Instead, he harbored a quiet determination to carve his own path, to become the kind of man who wouldn't discard his family for ambition. When he entered law school, it was with a purpose that went beyond power or prestige. Jake wanted to make a difference, to fight for justice, not just victories. Law school challenged him, but he thrived, driven by a passion that set him apart. His professors noted his keen intellect and his commitment to ethical law, and soon he became known not for his father's reputation, but for his own merit. By graduation, Jake had established himself as a rising star, and his choice to join a firm known for integrity further solidified his determination to build a career far removed from his father's shadow. One evening, as he pored over case files late into the night, Jake's phone rang. A call from his firm's managing partner, a man whose no-nonsense demeanor rarely invited pleasantries. "We have a case that needs your unique insight, Jake," the partner said, his voice laced with a subtle tension. "It's a corruption case involving a high-profile attorney, Paul Marston." Jake's hand tightened around the phone. The name landed like a punch to his chest, stirring memories he'd worked hard to suppress. He spent a moment in silence before responding. "Send me the files," he said, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. The following days were filled with hours of research, combing through evidence that painted a damning picture. Financial records of bribes, emails hinting at collusion, contracts pointing to fraud. It was a web of deceit crafted by none other than his father. Paul Marston, it seemed, had not only sacrificed his family but had built his empire on deception. As he prepared for the case, Jake found himself facing a moral crossroads. Could he prosecute his own father? The man who had shaped his life, however negatively, now stood as a symbol of everything he had come to despise in the legal profession. Rachel, sensing his turmoil, reminded him of the values she had instilled in him. "Do what's right, Jake," she told him softly. "Integrity is worth more than loyalty to someone who never valued it." When the trial date finally approached, Jake stood resolute. He would pursue justice, not out of vengeance but out of a duty to uphold the law. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial, buzzing with anticipation. Reporters and spectators filled every available seat, eager to witness the fall of Paul Marston, a titan of the legal world. It was a scandal that fed the media's hunger for drama, a once unassailable powerhouse attorney now facing the very justice system he'd manipulated for so long. But among the crowd, Jake was acutely aware of the weight of his role, not just as a prosecutor, but as Paul's son. Paul entered the courtroom with the same confident swagger he'd worn his entire career. Dressed immaculately in a tailored suit, he moved with the air of a man who was untouchable, who believed his charisma and reputation would save him from the jaws of justice. His gaze swept over the audience, and when it landed on Jake, there was a flicker of something unspoken. Pride, perhaps, or maybe a hint of resentment. To Paul, this trial was a mere inconvenience, a temporary hurdle he believed he would overcome as he always had. Jake took his place at the prosecutor's table, feeling a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to confront his father, to demand an explanation for years of neglect and abandonment. Another part of him, however, was painfully aware of the duty he carried, a duty to the law and to his clients, who had been wronged by his father's actions. This case was bigger than family. It was about integrity, about setting a standard that no one, not even Paul Marston, was above the law. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered with a calm intensity that captivated the jury. Jake presented the facts, detailing the breadth of the corruption scheme his team had uncovered. His words were measured, each point carefully crafted to under the gravity of Paul's actions without descending into personal vendettas. As he spoke, he felt the eyes of the courtroom on him, and a subtle shift rippled through the room. This wasn't just another prosecutor. This was Paul Marston's son, a man standing against his own blood in the pursuit of justice. Over the next several days, witness testimonies and evidence painted a picture of Paul's manipulation. Clients who had trusted him spoke of betrayals, contracts that had been doctored, and bribes that had flowed like water to secure his clients' positions. Jake's team presented financial records that tracked payments funneled through offshore accounts, emails laced with threats, and confidential documents forged to maintain his father's stronghold over the industry. Paul, for his part, maintained an unshakable composure, confident that he could maneuver his way out of this trap. He whispered commands to his defense team, who were clearly struggling to find ways to counter the avalanche of evidence piling up against him. But it was when Jake presented a piece of evidence Paul had thought long destroyed that his confidence finally cracked. A signed contract that directly linked him to one of the most scandalous bribes in the case. The document, long hidden and forgotten, was the keystone of the prosecution's argument. As Jake unveiled the evidence, he noticed a flicker of panic cross his father's face, a momentary lapse in Paul's stoic mask. It was a small victory, but one that resonated deeply. For the first time, Paul Marston realized he was no longer in control. He was caught in a web of his own making, with his son holding the threads. Jake's inner turmoil was palpable. He had spent years trying to distance himself from his father's shadow, building a career that stood on a foundation of integrity and truth. Yet here he was, forced into the role of his father's judge and potential executioner. As he cross-examined witnesses, presented evidence, and dissected Paul's defenses, he felt the weight of his mother's words echoing in his mind. Integrity, Jake. It's worth more than loyalty to a man who doesn't value it. On the stand, Paul finally cracked under Jake's relentless questioning. His attempts to manipulate the narrative faltered as Jake methodically unraveled each lie. His father's defense team scrambled to recover, but with every question Jake asked, he drove another nail into Paul's legal coffin. It was a surreal experience, standing in a courtroom, facing down the man who had given him life, yet had abandoned him without a second thought. And now that man was on the edge of ruin. As the prosecution rested its case, Jake felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. He had laid out the truth for all to see, exposing not only Paul's crimes but the emptiness behind the facade of power Paul had carefully constructed over decades. In that courtroom, the once mighty Paul Marston was reduced to a man desperately clinging to the illusion of control, his empire crumbling before him. And then, as if to deliver one final blow, Jake called his last witness, Rachel. Her presence in the courtroom was a quiet storm, her gaze steady and her voice unwavering as she recounted the years of hardship and sacrifice she had endured. She spoke not out of bitterness but with a calm dignity, detailing the struggles of raising Jake alone, the countless hours she'd worked to provide for him, and the principles she'd instilled in him. Her words painted a stark contrast to the life Paul had chosen, and the courtroom listened in rapt silence as she shared her story. When Rachel finished her testimony, a profound silence settled over the room. Paul sat motionless, his usual bravado shattered by the truth laid bare before him. The man who had once ruled the legal world was now reduced to a figure of pity, exposed not just as a criminal but as a father who had abandoned his family in his pursuit of power. In the quiet of that courtroom, Jake felt the weight of his choice, to stand for justice, even when it meant standing against his own blood. He had upheld his principles, honoring the values his mother had instilled in him. As the jury filed out to deliberate, he knew that whatever the outcome, he had chosen a path that was his own, free from the shadows of his father's ambition. The case was far from over, but the reckoning had begun. The jury's deliberation was brief, but to Jake, each passing minute stretched like hours. He sat at the prosecutor's table, feeling the enormity of his choice settle over him. Rachel sat a few rows behind him, a silent pillar of support, her presence a grounding force that reminded him why he was here. She had raised him with unwavering principles, and now those values were the foundation upon which he stood, facing down the man who had discarded them both. When the jury returned, their expressions were solemn, and a murmur rippled through the room. Jake rose, his gaze steady as the foreperson read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Paul Marston, the once revered titan of the legal world, had been brought down, not by a rival or a scandal, but by his own son, a poetic twist of fate that no one in the courtroom could overlook. The judge turned to Paul, his face impassive as he pronounced the sentence. Paul would serve a lengthy prison term, his career effectively destroyed, his reputation irreparably tarnished. For the first time, Paul's composure broke. He sank into his chair, the weight of his downfall pressing on him with a force he could no longer resist. He glanced toward Jake, his expression a mixture of disbelief and regret. It was as if he finally understood the consequences of his actions, the impact of years spent chasing power at the expense of those he should have cherished. After the sentencing, as the courtroom began to empty, Paul was escorted out in handcuffs. But before he was taken away, he turned to Jake, his voice a broken whisper. "Jake, you're my son. Please help me." The words were almost pleading, a stark contrast to the arrogance that had once defined him. Jake looked at him, his heart conflicted. Here was the man who had cast him and his mother aside, who had chosen ambition over family, now stripped of everything he'd once held dear. The irony was sharp, and for a moment, Jake felt a pang of pity. But he also knew that this was the result of Paul's choices, the culmination of a life spent prioritizing success over loyalty and love. "I became what you never could, Dad," Jake said quietly, his voice steady. "I upheld the law, even when it meant standing against you." There was no anger in his words, only a sense of finality. He had done his duty, and in doing so, he had freed himself from the shadow of his father's influence. Paul's gaze lingered, searching for a hint of forgiveness, a glimmer of hope that perhaps Jake would extend a hand. But there was nothing to grasp, no bridge to cross. With a final nod, Jake turned away, walking out of the courtroom with Rachel at his side. For him, this was the end of a long journey, a journey marked by betrayal and resilience, but one that had ultimately led him to a place of integrity and peace. In the months that followed, Jake's career continued to thrive. His role in the case had garnered respect and admiration from peers and the public alike, not because he had brought down a powerful man, but because he had upheld the values that made him who he was. He had proven once and for all that he was more than Paul Marston's son. He was a man of his own making, guided by the principles his mother had instilled in him, principles that had carried him through the darkest of times. For Jake, the reckoning was over. He had chosen justice over blood, integrity over loyalty to a man who had never valued him, and as he looked toward the future, he knew that he had built a legacy that was truly his own, one free from the shadows of his father's ambition, and one that would stand as a testament to the strength of character his mother had always believed he possessed. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.